All right, we're now live on Facebook. Good morning, Facebook. Welcome to our Sunday morning service and teaching live from the Oasis. My name is Mike Davis. I was told to slow down this time. I am one of the leaders and teachers at our fellowship, the Oasis. So glad that you are here with us. I'm one of several. I'm not the only one. I'm one of several. Hopefully in the future, you'll be able to see some of our other teachers. I've been thinking about bringing them on live so they can teach and share with you also. But I'm glad that you are here this morning. Let's pray as we get into the study of our word, of the word of God this morning. So Father, we come to you and we thank you for just teaching us and instructing us in the way that we are to go, counseling us with your eye upon us. Father, as we come to the study of your word this morning, we pray, as we just prayed in our private fellowship, that you would fill us with the knowledge of your will in all wisdom and spiritual understanding, so that we all can walk worthy of you unto all pleasing and be fruitful in every good work. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. Well, I am happy to be here with you again. We are continuing this new series on, and we're calling it, Who's the Boss? Women and Men in Biblical and Cultural Context. So this is message number 2. We started off last week exploring and talking about this message, why it's called Who the Boss. If you want to know why, go back and watch message number 1. By the way, you can go to our YouTube channel, KIC TV, keeping it in context with Mike Davis. Go there. And the messages from Saturday, I upload them as quickly as possible right after the message here is over. But you can watch last week's message there if you want to see it, or if you want to direct somebody to where they can find it, that is where they can find it. And we're also working on some other things. My wife Karen is working on some other things to where you will be able to get access to my notes. Okay, so we're working on that. And I'll let you know as soon as that's done and ready. Okay, so last week we began exploring the different contexts or frames, or as I like to call it, the contextual frames we should use when we're studying the topic of women in the Bible, women and men in the Bible. And I'd like you to turn to Ephesians chapter 6. Ephesians chapter 6. I'm just going to do a really quick recap, and then there's a lot we have to get into today. Hang on for just a second. Just realized I don't have my timer to help me to keep track of time. So there's a lot of different things that we are going to be covering here. Okay, here we go. So hang on. So one of the things we started talking about last week is the importance of the contextual frames that we utilize when we are interpreting the Bible, and especially when we are dealing with how do we understand the relationship between men and women in the Bible? How do we understand women in terms of leadership? How do we understand women in terms of leadership in the home, in the church, in society? And I said that it's important for us to recognize that there are certain frames, contextual frames, that we need to utilize when we are doing this, because the context of the frames that we are using are important. And the reason they're important is because they determine the meaning that we draw from the biblical text. I share with you that a frame, but when I'm talking about a frame, I'm talking about a frame of reference. A frame of reference is whatever you are referring to know how you should think, to know how you should feel, to know how you should act. I gave the simple illustration. If I was to ask you, what's your name? You would tell me what your name is. But if I was to ask you, how do you know that's your name? Now I'm asking you for your frame of reference, that which lets you know that your name is your name. So you would go inside your mind and you would consider maybe one or two or several frame of references that would establish for you that your name is your name. You might say, my parents gave me this name. My parents called me this all my life. That's a frame of reference. You might say, my driver's license has my name on it. That's a frame of reference. You might say my birth certificate has my name on it. That's a frame of reference. So your frame of reference is whatever you refer to in order to know how you should think, how you should feel, how you should act or behave. Okay? We all have mental frames of references that we live from, all of us. And we bring those frame of references to the Bible. This is how frame of references help you to make sense out of the things that you read in life. If you read a book, in order to understand the words in the book, you've got to have a frame of reference that will help you to understand what that means. So like I shared with you last week, there is a phrase that I often heard from my grandmother when I was growing up. My grandmother at times would say to me, boy, you don't believe fat meat's greasy, okay? Now, if you don't have a frame of reference for that, and the frame of reference for that could be either you grew up in an African-American community, you grew up in the South, you grew up in the South in an African-American community, or you grew up in my household, okay? If you don't have that frame of reference, my words don't make any sense to you. Now, you understand every single word. You understand, you don't believe fat meats greasy. Individually, you can understand what each of those words mean. You could go look up each of those words. However, those words together, what do they mean? In order to really know what they mean, you have to be a part of the culture. You have to possess the cultural framework, the cultural dictionary, if you would, in order to make sense out of the words that I'm saying. As I shared with you last week, the phrase, you don't believe fat meats greasy, depending on context, could have at least one or two meanings. There are times, I remember one time my grandmother was helping me with my math homework, and she said, this is how you do it. My grandmother was really smart. And she said, this is how you should do it. And I kept saying, no, that's not how my teacher did it. That's not how my teacher did it. And she goes, no, this is the way you do it. I go, no. And we called her Nita. I said, Nita, this is not how it's done. This is not what my teacher did. I was like third or fourth grade, right? And I experienced that with my children. It's like they go to school, the teacher becomes the authority, and all of a sudden you cease to be the authority, right? And so I kept telling her, no, this is not how my teacher. And my grandmother looked at me and said, you don't believe fat meats greasy. Now, what does she mean by that? She meant in that context, I'm telling you how it is. I'm telling you the truth. I'm giving you the facts, and you don't believe it, even though the facts are right here. The truth is right here in front of you. You're not believing it. So that's what it means by you don't believe fat meats greasy in that context. She also could say it with a certain tone that gave a different meaning, similar yet different. If she said to me, boy, with that tone, boy, you don't believe fat meats greasy. That meant with that tone of voice, you are in trouble, Mike. You are about to get, if she told me to stop doing something, she's, Mike, stop, don't do that. Stop it. That second or third time she'll go, oh, you don't believe fat meats greasy, do you? That didn't simply mean you don't believe the truth as it is before you. It also meant in that context with that tone, you are about to get in trouble. You're about to get spanked. Or as I said last week, as we say in the African American community, you're about to get a whooping. Okay. Now, again, the meaning of the phrase is determined not only by the dictionary definition of the words, but also by culture, by tone. If you were to take, you don't believe fat meats greasy, and look up each of those individual words in a dictionary, it would not give you the cultural meaning. If you divorce the tone and the setting, you may not get exactly what is being said. So all of those frames are important in order to understand a simple phrase, you don't believe fat meats greasy. You couldn't just take the plain meaning of that based upon dictionary definition and come up with the meaning that I gave you, okay? When I've taught in Bible schools and Bible classes, I've taught this, and I said, does anybody here know what that means? And if you didn't come from the African-American community, most people didn't know what it meant. If they were from a community other than the African-American community, they had no idea what that meant. They were like, I've never even heard that before. Okay, there are sometimes some Black people would go, I've never heard that before. But a lot of them who grew up in the South, that grew up in African-American communities where their families were from the South, they knew what it meant. They instantly knew. And they even knew when I said, if you change the tone, they go, yeah, it means something completely different. So what's my point? We all being framed. See, in order to understand the words, you've got to have a frame. Now you've got a frame. Now, if you ever hear, you don't believe fat meats greasy, you now have a frame of reference. You go, oh, Mike said, I'm your frame of reference now. You get what I'm saying? So frames of reference are important when you're studying the biblical text because they will determine the meaning that you derive from the text or the meaning that you give to the text. So this is why frames are so important. So the frames that we use when studying passages that have to do with women is going to influence our interpretation of those passages, and it's going to influence the meaning and the application. It's going to influence the meaning that we give to the text or the meaning that we derive from the text, and it's going to influence our application of the text. This is why contextual frames are so important, because the wrong contextual frame will lead to the wrong interpretation and the wrong meaning that we get from the text. It will lead to the wrong meaning that we get from the text. And this will in turn determine what we teach about women and how we treat women, okay? In the church, in the home, and in society, All right. Now, the two frames, we looked at two frames last week. And these were two frames. I said we need to use these frames and bring them with us when we are studying the passages about women. And actually when you're studying anything biblically, these are some frames that I believe are really important. Not just I believe it. I've learned this from other scholars. I've learned this from years of studying the scriptures. These are the two frames we talked about last week. Number one, the Bible, while for us, was not originally written to us. You need to bring that frame, that concept, that way of thinking to the biblical text. That the Bible, while it is for us, it's for you and I today. It was not originally written to us. Okay, what do we mean by that? And by the way, I got that from Dr. John Walton, who is a biblical scholar. I believe his specialty is the Old Testament. Now, why is that important? Because as we said last week, the Bible was written to people in different times, in different cultures, with a different language. And then at many times, things were said and done to people in specific situations. And so we have to take that into account. We can't start with our 21st century situation, our 21st century culture, our 21st century experiences, and then bring that to the text and think that Paul or Peter or Moses or Isaiah is talking directly to us first, as if they're here now living, talking to us. You see what I'm saying? And so when we, last week, when we read things like in Ephesians chapter 5, wives, submit yourselves to your husbands. Husbands, love your wives as Christ also loved the church. Children, be obedient to your parents. And slaves, be obedient to, well, let me stop there. We talk about wives being submitted, husbands loving their wives, fathers loving their children and raising their children, parents, children being obedient to their parents. We read that as if Paul was writing specifically and directly to us. Now, there is a place for that, but not before you think about and say, wait a minute, and you realize this, while it is for me, was not originally written to me, okay? So then what do? When you recognize that, that goes to the second contextual frame, which is when we're reading the biblical text, we have to ask, how would the original audience to whom this was written to, or to whom this was spoken to, how would they have understood what was written and spoken to them? What was written and or spoken to them? How would they have understood it? So when people in the first century world of Ephesus, when they read, wives, submit yourselves unto your husbands as unto the Lord, when they read, children, submit yourselves, children, obey your mother and father, honor your mother and father, how would they have understood this? So I gave several examples last week. Won't get into all of them now. I'm going to go back and cover one a little bit more. But we said this is important because these two very important contextual frames, we want to keep them in mind because it's going to influence how we read the text. So for instance, when it says children, honor your mother and father, children, obey your parents. We read that and we think about children under the age of 18. You have to obey your parents. You're living at home. You have to obey your parents. But in the first century world, the first century Greco-Roman world, the first century Jewish world, children, even adult children, were under the authority of their fathers. As I said last week, if you were an adult in the first century Jewish and or Greco-Roman world, let's say you were 50 years old and your father was 80 years old, you are still under the authority of your father. In the Jew, now we don't think that way today. Here in America and in the West and in a lot of different countries, once you get past an age which is considered mature or the adult, here I think it's 18. You become legally an adult. You're allowed to do whatever you want to do. You're free. You can move out. You can go live your life. That's the way it's understood. But in the first century world, this is not the way it was understood. When it was said, hey, children, be obedient to your parents, that included even if you were over the age of 15. If your father was still alive, if your mother was still alive, you were under their authority until they died. And then once they died, if you were a female, well, if you were a female, you would come under the authority of the oldest male in your household. Okay. What if you had no oldest male? Well, if your father only had daughters? Oh, then whose authority do you come under? Well, what if you're married and your father, oh, and by the way, here's the other thing. If you are married in the first century and your father was still alive, in the Greco-Roman world, you were not under the authority of your husband, you were under the authority of your father. Did you know that? In the first century Greco-Roman world, if you were married, you were not actually under the authority, you were under the authority of your father. Once you got married, the authority from your father did not transfer to your husband. You were still, by Greco-Roman law, under the authority of your father. If your father died, guess what? You were not under the authority of your husband. Once your father died, that doesn't mean, well, okay, now the husband's in charge. Nope, that's not what that meant at all. So whose authority were you under? Well, stay with me. We're going to cover that in the future. I know I'm teasing. I shouldn't do that, but we're going to be covering that more in the future, all right? As we talk about women in the ancient world and women in the Greco-Roman world of the first century, women in the ancient Near East of the Old Testament, and women in the first century Greco-Roman world of the New Testament. We're going to talk about the authority structures, because these are the things, these are context, these are cultural context that often are not explained when these passages are read about family. And the other one that we covered had to do with slaves. We said, and this is, if you go to Ephesians chapter 6, I said last week, often when people teach about family, they read Ephesians chapter 5, verse 22, all the way down to chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, where it talks about, it talks about in Ephesians 5:22 starts talking about wives, talks about husbands and their relationship. Then in Ephesians chapter 6, it talks about children. People stop there and they go, this is God's instruction to the family. But as we said last week, in the first century Greco-Roman world, and even the first century Jewish world, which was a part of the Greco-Roman world, slaves were considered part of and this is the term scholars use, the familia, which is kind of spelled like family. It looks like family when you first look at it, but it doesn't really mean family. Family today means a wife, a husband, a wife, 2.5 kids, maybe a cat or a dog, okay? In the first century world, a familia, the family, the household, actually consisted of the husband, the wife, the children, slaves, clients. We'll talk about that more in the future. People who were dependent upon the paterfamilias, the head of the household, who was usually the oldest male in the household, usually the man. It could be clients, tenants. Am I missing anybody? Associations, all of these people, clubs, all of these people could be considered part of the familia. So in Ephesians chapter 6, Ephesians chapter 5 on down to verse 6, the whole concept of family, as we think about it today, doesn't stop with the children. It goes on to slave. So how do you apply that? How do you apply that? What cultural frame? Because we tend to stop and go, okay, family, Ephesians chapter 5, starting at verse 22, on into Ephesians chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, and we leave off the part about the slaves. Okay, and then and as I said last week, what we tend to do when we talk about Ephesians chapter 6, verse 5 through 9, we change the meaning and we go, well, this is talking about the relationship between employers and employees, or we say the way we would apply it today is talking about the relationship between employers and employees. But that is taking the text out of its cultural context, and that's making the slaves no longer part of the familia, no longer part of the household. It's simply reading the text wrong. So when you start to put this verse, and we're going to look at Ephesians chapter 6, verses 5 through 9, when you start to put it back in its context, now we start to have some difficulties about how we interpret this text and how we interpret it in terms of the relationship between men and women. So in Ephesians chapter 5, you go there, Ephesians chapter 6, I'm sorry, look at verse 5. It says, bondservants, literally it's talking about slaves, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling and sincerity of heart as to Christ, not with eye service as men pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, with goodwill doing service as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatever good anyone does, he will receive the same from the Lord, whether he is slave or free. Verse 9, and you masters, do the same thing, do the same things to them, giving up threatening, knowing that your own master also is in heaven, and there is no partiality with him. Now, again, as I shared with you last week, in the first century world, the person that was addressed as the husband, the father, and the master, as a rule, was the same person. The husband was the father father was the master. This is the way Greco-Roman households were set up. So in all likelihood, if Paul had in his, if there was in the Ephesians congregation a slave master, he probably also had children. He probably also had wives. So Paul, when he's talking, he's not talking to three different people. He's talking to the same person when he addresses the husband, the father, and the slave master. He's talking to the same person. Okay. Now, why is this important? Because again, the context, we see the importance of frames when we begin to apply this. Paul here in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 5-9, who is he giving instructions to? The slaves and the master. So keep in mind again, while the Bible is for us, it was not originally written to us. This was not originally written to us. We do not have slaves today as part of our households. That's not. And if you go, what if I'm rich and I have servants? Still doesn't count. Servants, as we think of them today, are not the same as slaves in the first century world. And I covered this last week. Okay, so this was originally written to people living in Ephesus in the first century Greco-Roman world. It was not originally written to us or to other people in the centuries following the first century. So who were the masters that Paul was addressing? Were they men or they women? If you watched last week, you know the answer. It was both. It was both. Men and women could be slave masters. And if you notice here, again, in verse 9, when it says, and you masters do the same, Paul does not specify if he's talking to a male slave master or a female slave master. You mean, Mike, females could be the master over slaves? Absolutely, in two ways. Number one, and we're going to be talking about this more when we talk about the structure of households in the first century, but a female, if she was married, she was considered the mater familias. She was considered the mother of the household, and she ran the household. So slaves would be under her rule. Okay, the slave, if they had slaves, they would be under her rule. And the way it was set up in the first century, we're talking about first century Greco-Roman custom and the world, the culture in which it was set. So you had men at the top, women underneath that, then you had children, and then you had slaves. That was the hierarchy. Men were considered to be the rulers. Everyone else was considered to be the ruled. So men were the rulers, women were the ruled, children were the ruled, slaves were the ruled. It was still a hierarchy. Women would rule over children and over slaves. Matter of fact, this was also seen as superior and inferior. Men were considered superior, women inferior, children inferior, at least for a specific amount of time until their rational faculties got developed. And then the male the male children would be seen as now they could also be heads over their own household once the father died. Okay, but until then, matter of fact, Paul even addresses this when he says in Galatians chapter 4 that children, while they are children, are under the rule of guardians and stewards because they are seen as not being able to rule themselves. So you've got, again, husbands are the superior, the inferiors are women, this is the hierarchy, children, and then slaves. Okay, but women could rule over, they were seen as being in a superior position to the slaves, even though they were inferior to their husbands. And I'm using that language on purpose because that was the language that was used in the first century. Okay, so the women were in submission to the husbands in the first century Greco-Roman world. Slaves would be in submission to the master and to wives. But also you had certain women who were single, you had certain women who were widows, and they were the heads of their own households. They could be the heads of their own households. In other words, they didn't have a husband. They were the heads of their own households, and they would have slaves. And so when Paul says, masters, this is how you're to treat your slaves, he could be talking to not only men, but also women. We know Paul had women, and we know he had women who were part of the congregations who were head of their own households. Women like Lydia, women like Nympha, women like, the name escapes me right now. But there are several women in the New Testament Chloe. Paul talks about those who come from Chloe and those of Chloe's household. These are women who it appears to be they were single and they had their own household. These were women of means. These were women who had money. I believe Tabitha was another one who was a woman of means, well-to-do, had her own household. Their husbands are not mentioned. So either they were single, which was a possibility, or they were widows and they were the heads of their household and they would have had slaves. Okay, so why is this significant? Why is this significant about the fact that Paul could have been talking and probably was talking in all probability? He was talking to female slave owners, because in the teaching of those who hold what we call a complementarian view, who believe that men are to lead, women are to follow, those who hold this view teach that women are to follow the lead of men in the home, in the church, and some teach in society. Not all believe that, but there are some who teach women are to follow men. Men are to be in charge, and women are to follow in the home, in the church, and in society. Women are not to be in charge of men in the home, in the church, and some believe, not all, complementarian view, some believe that they are not to be in charge where society, only men are. Okay, let me share with you some things. And by the way, this is taught on the basis of 1 Timothy chapter 2. Go over to 1 Timothy chapter 2. We're going to be looking in the future at this text in detail, but I want you to look at 1 Timothy chapter 2, look at verse 12. You've probably heard this before. Oops, I'm in Thessalonians, that doesn't help. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 12. It reads, actually, let me back up to, verse 12, I'm right. And I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man, but to be in silence. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. So based upon this scripture, and there are others, one of the other ones is they believe that Genesis chapter 2, or more specifically, Genesis chapter 1 through chapter 3, that they believe that, and Genesis 3:16, that these all teach that men are to lead, they are to have authority, that women are not to rule, women are not to lead, and women are not to have authority over men in the home, in the church, or some teach in society in general. Okay, so there are those based upon this scriptures and others, which we'll be getting into, but these are the primary scriptures: 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 12 through 13, Genesis chapter 2, which we're going to look at in a moment, or some say Genesis chapter 1 through 3, and especially Genesis chapter 3, verse 16, where God says to the woman, your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. And there are those who teach, see, from Genesis chapter 1 to Genesis chapter 3, it is taught that men are to be in charge. Men are to lead. And they teach this is God's creation order. This is God's design for the home. It is God's design for the church. And some teach this is God's design for society. And they believe that when what they believe is God's design and order, when it is inverted, in other words, when women are in charge, when women begin to lead, it is a detriment to the home, it is a detriment to the church, and is a detriment to society. This is the belief, because the belief is you are going contrary to God's design. You're going contrary to God's order. And they believe that because God said, they believe that because the Apostle Paul wrote in 1 Timothy 2, I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man. And because they believe it, when it says, for Adam was formed first, and then the woman, this plainly shows that women are not to be in authority, men are to be in authority. This is God's design. They will say this is even God's, it is the design of creation, or it's a creational design. It was an order of creation. Now, let me read to you and give you some proof of this from, where's my book at? Oh man, I was supposed to have a book here. Oh, here it is. Okay. Okay, so this is a complementarian book. I would say this is and I mean this in a positive way, not in a derogatory way. This is the complementarian Bible, as it were, for their beliefs. In other words, this book is called Rediscovering Biblical Manhood and womanhood. And this book is a compilation of essays, of articles by different complementarian scholars, those who believe that men are to be the primary leaders, women are to follow. And by the way, as I said last week, complementarians don't say women can't have leadership, that you can't have leadership over men. You can have leadership over other women. You can have leadership over children, okay? But you can't be in leadership over men in home or in the church. And some, not all, some teach in society. In the outward secular world, women are not supposed to be in leadership. It's supposed to be primarily men. So a bunch of scholars got together. They wrote some articles to prove their point. The book that was written, the opposite of this for egalitarians again believe that men and women have equal authority, not just equal value, but equal authority, and that any role in life, any position in life, in the home, in the church, that a man can fulfill, a woman can also fulfill. Now, we're not talking about things like having children, okay? Men can't have children. That's what women do, okay? Men provide the seed for women to have children. Women can't do that. But they're talking about in different tasks, different functions. Women can have the same functions in the home, in the church, and in society. And a book that was written to prove that, which is the opposite of this book, is this book here, Discovering Biblical Equality. Okay, so I'm just going to let you know, these are the two primary books, and this is written by several scholars. It's edited by Ronald Pierce, Cynthia Long Westfall, and Krista McKirkland. These are the editors of the book, and it gives the egalitarian viewpoint from a lot of different perspectives, okay, and different topics. If you want to know more about this in a very scholarly, detailed way, these are the two books I would recommend for you, okay? Doesn't mean that I agree with everything in any book, and it doesn't mean that I disagree with everything, but you will see where my agreements and disagreements come. For the record, if I didn't state this last week, I think I did state it, but I would be classified as an egalitarian, or some people refer to it as a mutualist, which is basically the same thing, which means I believe that any function that a man can do in the home, in the church, or in society, a woman can also do that they are not restricted on the basis of their gender, and that God does not restrict them in the scriptures, okay? Now, I have to prove that, right? Just saying it is not enough. So this is why I spent the past 2 years in intensive research, spent 4 or 5 years in that reading things at different times. Okay, so let's talk about from here, what I'm called the Complementarian Bible, meaning that this is one of the go-to books that they look at. This is the editors of this is John Piper, who in some circles is well-known. He's a well-known author and pastor, and Wayne Grudem. Both of these men are highly respected. I have respect for these men. I do not agree with them, and sometimes I'm quite shocked at some of the things that they say. But this is the go-to book. They are the editors of the book. It has a lot of different authors. They're the editors of the books. So I wanted you to know the books that I'm dealing with. That's why I'm bringing them before you. So let me read to you what is said about women and their place in the home and the church, or their roles, their function in the home, the church, and society. So this is from page 75 of the book, page 75. And the chapter is called An Overview of Central Concerns. And the way they did it here is that they wrote down some questions that people normally would have, and then they give their answers to the question. This is page 75. This is question 6 and 7. Question 6 says, what do you mean when you call the husband the head? What do you mean by that? Like in Ephesians chapter 5, we just read. And they give the answer, quote, in the home, biblical headship is the husband's divine calling to take primary responsibility for Christ-like leadership, protection, and provision. Then question 7, where in the Bible do you get the idea that husbands should be the leaders in their home? They answer, quote, the most explicit texts relating directly to headship and submission in marriage are Ephesians 5:21 through 33, Colossians 3:18 through 19, 1 Peter 3:1 through 7, and Titus 2:5. Also, skip this out, 1 Timothy 3:4 and verse 12, and then Genesis 1 through 3. Now notice I said Genesis 1 through 3, Genesis chapter 1 through chapter 3. The chapters of this book relating to these texts give the detailed exegetical support for why we believe they teach that headship includes primary leadership and that this is the responsibility of the man. Moreover, in view of these teaching passages, the pattern of male leadership that pervades the biblical portrait of family life is probably not a mere cultural phenomenon over thousands of years, but reflects God's original design, even though corrupted by sin. So here they are saying that from their perspective and their interpretation of the text, the biblical portrait of family life is probably not a mere cultural phenomenon over thousands of years, but it reflects God's original design, even though corrupted by sin. Now, what's interesting here, and we'll cover this some more next week, because there's a part 3 when we're going to talk about text, context, because I want to make sure, by the way, I want to make sure I'm laying this down in a way that you really understand. So I'm taking my time, not trying to rush through it. But they say that the biblical portrait of family life, and notice this, the biblical portrait of family life, they don't include slavery in this. Even though, as I've said, in the first century world, and even before, slavery was part of the family life. I will share with you next week when they say, well, we don't believe family is a part of this. In one sense, they're contradicting themselves, because they say the biblical portrait of family life is probably not a mere cultural phenomenon over thousands of years, but reflect God's original design, even though corrupted by sin. As I will show you next week, they'll say, well, that doesn't count for slavery, though. Here they say family life, but how do you define family? Again, context. How is family defined? Family is not in the Bible simply defined as husband, wife, and children. That is not the biblical definition of family or the biblical portrait of family in the ancient Near East or in the first century Greco-Roman world. So there's a contradiction there, though they explain it, and we'll get into that next week. All right, but they believe that the idea of man ruling over women, this is the point, that this is God's design from the beginning of creation. Let me read to you from page 74 and question number 2. They says, what do you mean by unbiblical female leadership in the church? What do you mean? Because there's a question there about, and they answered something, they talked about unbiblical female leadership in the church. They said, so a person asked, what do you mean by that? We are persuaded, and this has to do with, so we talked about the home, men are to be the primary leaders. This has to do with the church. What do you mean? I'll read in question number 1 by unbiblical female leadership in the church. We are persuaded that the Bible teaches that only men should be pastors and elders. That is, men should bear primary responsibility for Christ-like leadership and teaching in the church. So it is unbiblical, we believe, and therefore detrimental for women to assume this role. Now, I find that amazing, but they believe not only is it unbiblical, but it is detrimental for women to be in primary leadership roles in the church as like pastor and elders, what we would call senior leadership. They believe that it is detrimental and unbiblical for women to do so. Why? Well, because of the scriptures that we just read earlier from 1 Timothy chapter 2. That's one of the scriptures that they utilize. Matter of fact, this goes into question number 3. Questions 3. Where in the Bible do you get the idea that only men should be the pastors and the elders of the church? They say, quote, the most explicit text relating directly to the leadership of men in the church are 1 Timothy 2, 11 through 15, which we read, 1 Corinthians 14, 34 through 36, which we will get into, and 1 Corinthians 11, 2 through 16, which we will also read. The chapters in this book on these texts will give the detailed exegetical support for why we believe these texts give abiding sanction to an eldership of spiritual men. Moreover, the biblical connection between family and church strongly suggests that the headship of the husband at home leads naturally to the primary leadership of spiritual men in the church. Okay, so again, in terms of the church, they believe that because in their view, the Bible shows, again, this portrait of family life where the men are the head. This suggests that the headship of the husband at home leads naturally to the primary leadership of spiritual men in the church. So you see the connection there, that the portrait of men at home leads and suggests that men are to be in charge at the church. Now, again, we're looking at their interpretation of these texts. So this had to do, again, with the first one we read, had to do with home. This one has to do with church. Let me read to you now. John Piper's understanding of what it means to be masculine or a man and what it means to be feminine or a woman. Let me read you his definition from the same book. This is from page 41, and I believe it's chapter 1. Yeah, chapter 1, A Vision of Biblical Complementarity. Okay, so page 41, this is John Piper's definition of what it means to be masculine. Because John Piper kept asking, well, if men and women, according to the egalitarian or mutualist point of view, if men and women can function in the same roles, they can they are the same where it comes to the function of roles, functioning in terms of leadership, then what's the difference between a man and a woman? Excuse me. How do you define what's the difference between the two? And he would always say, egalitarians don't answer that question. Okay, so he gives his definition of what is masculine, what is manhood. He says, at the heart of mature masculinity is a sense of benevolent responsibility to lead, to provide for, and protect women in ways appropriate to a man's differing relationships. Let me read that again. At the heart of, quote, at the heart of mature masculinity is a sense of benevolent responsibility to lead, provide for, and protect women in ways appropriate to a man's differing relationships. So he sees that this is what it means to be a man, and that men are to lead, that part of masculinity is to lead, part of masculinity is to provide, part of masculinity, part of what it means to be a man is to protect women in ways appropriate to a man's different relationship, meaning that you can have different relationships with different women. So, you know, your relationship with your wife might be different than your relationship with your sister, however, or relationship with a female coworker. However, as a man, you are to have a sense of benevolent responsibility to lead, to provide, and protect them as appropriate for the relationship. The main idea is that you lead, okay? You're the leader here. All right, so that's how he defines men, masculinity. How does he define womanhood? How does he define femininity? This is on page 57, where he defines femininity. Now, ladies, keep in mind as I read this, this is what John Piper said. Mike didn't write this, okay? At the heart of, quote, at the heart of mature femininity is a freeing disposition to affirm, receive, and nurture strength and leadership from worthy men in ways appropriate to a woman's differing relationships. Let me read that again. That was end quote. So, quote, at the heart of mature femininity, at the heart of what it means to be a woman, is a freeing disposition to affirm, receive, and nurture strength and leadership from worthy men in ways appropriate to a woman's differing relationship. So the role of a woman, in John Piper's view, is that you, the heart of being a woman, the core of being a woman, is that you affirm, you receive, you nurture strength and leadership from worthy men. Now, you might have different relationships. So again, the relationship to your father would be different than the relationship to your husband, which would be different from your relationship to a male coworker or your cousin who's a man. The relationship would differ. However, even though the relationships would be different, still at the core, what you're going to do is affirm, you're going to receive, you're going to nurture the strength and leadership within these men. In different ways, yes, not in the same ways because you've got different relationships, but that's at the core of what it means to be a woman, according to John Piper. Did anybody, any of you women listen to this, did you just spit out your coffee when I read that? When I first read this and doing research, I went, whoa, really? And so then I went and read, now I've got 3 daughters and a wife. I went and read this to my 3 daughters and they were like, I'm sorry, what? Because the idea here is that a woman, basically, the core of your femininity, the core of what it means to be a woman, revolves around a man. That's the idea that John Piper is giving here. Let me read to you what he says about this. Now, for those of you watching on Facebook, please share your comments as you hear this. What do you think about this? Even those of you here in Zoom, write your comments here as to what you think about this as you hear this and the definition of what it means to be a woman. Excuse me. On the surface, it sounds cool. It's like, well, you know, I want to support my man. And there's nothing wrong with that. I want to support my husband. I want to support other men. That's good and positive. But the idea here is that the core, at the heart, he says, at the core of what it means for you to be a woman is that you are to really be supportive of men. That's why you're here. That's why God created you, to affirm, to receive, and to nurture strength and leadership from men. Let me read to you what he says, again, from this book. This is page 59. Starting at page 59. I'm going to actually do a little bit of reading here because I don't want to be accused of taking him out of his context. So I thought about it. I went, nope, I'm going to read as much of this as possible. This is page 59, and I'm going to read from page 59 to 62. I can't believe I've already gone 40 minutes on this. Okay. He explains what he means by in ways appropriate to a woman's different relationship. And he says, am I in the right place? Yeah. Page 59, he says, at the heart, he quotes again his definition. At the heart of mature femininity is a freeing disposition to affirm, receive, and nurture strength and leadership from worthy men in ways appropriate to a woman's different relationship. He goes on to say, mature femininity does not express itself in the same way toward every man. Now, I said that. I want to make sure I quoted him correctly. A mature woman who is married, for example, does not welcome the same kind of strength and leadership from another man that she welcomes from her husband. Now, notice, it's not that she doesn't welcome strength and leadership. She doesn't welcome it. She doesn't welcome the same kind. So it's a different one. She is still welcoming, receiving, affirming strength and leadership from a man. It's just different than from her husband. But she will affirm and receive and nurture the strength and leadership of men in some form in all her relationships with men. Now, let me share with you his definition of affirm, receive, and nurture. This is on page 58. The word affirm means that mature women advocate the kind of masculine, feminine complementarity that we are describing here. This is because femininity is a disposition to affirm the strength and leadership of worthy men, not just to experience it firsthand. So you affirm their leadership. Okay, receive means that mature femininity feels natural and glad to accept the strength and leadership of worthy men. So again, this talks about the core of what it means to be a woman according to the definition of John Piper, which, as some have pointed out, who happens to be a man. Okay, receive means that mature femininity feels natural and glad. So a woman who is mature will feel natural and glad to accept the strength and leadership of worthy men. She does not want to reverse these roles. She is glad when he is not passive. Oh, let me go back and read it. A mature woman is glad when a respectful, caring, upright man offers sensitive strength and provides a pattern of appropriate initiatives in their relationship. Now, technically speaking, what he's saying is not wrong here. Any woman who's experiencing that with a man, that's going to be a good thing. That he is caring, he's upright, he's respectful. Yes, that's a good thing. I'm not arguing against that. She does not. So a mature woman is glad when a respectful, caring, upright man offers sensitive strength and provides a pattern of appropriate initiatives in their relationship. She does not want to reverse these roles. In other words, she doesn't want to be the one doing this. She is glad when he's not passive. She feels herself enhanced and honored and freed by his caring, strength, and servant leadership. Nurture means that a mature woman senses a responsibility not merely to receive, but to nurture and strengthen the resources of masculinity. Now, one of the things that one of my teachers always taught me is you never use a word to define a word. He doesn't really define what nurture means here. He just kind of reiterates the word nurture again. But he says nurture, maybe he means by that strengthen the resources of masculinity. So the idea of receiving from a man means that you should feel natural and glad to accept the strength and leadership of worthy men. This is how John Piper defines womanhood. Oops, not supposed to close. I got some more for you to read to you. So he says that a mature woman will receive and nurture the strength and leadership of men in some form in all her relationships with men. This is true even though she may find herself in roles that put some men in a subordinate role to her. Without passing any judgment on the appropriateness of any of these roles, one thinks of the following possible instances. So even though as a woman, you might find yourself in a position of leadership where men are subordinate to you, you still are going to be affirming, receiving, and nurturing their masculinity and their strength. Here are some possible roles where a woman might be in charge. prime minister and her counselors and advisors, principal and the teachers in her school, college teachers and her students, bus driver and her passengers, bookstore manager and her clerks and stock help, staff doctors and her interns, lawyers and her aides, judge and the court personnel, police officers and citizens in her precinct, legislator and her assistants, TV newscaster and her editors, counselor and her clients. Now, these are positions he's saying that women can be in positions of leadership and men might be subordinate to the woman. One or more of these roles might stretch appropriate expressions of femininity beyond the breaking point. But in any case, regardless of the relationships in which a woman finds herself, mature femininity will seek to express itself in appropriate ways. There are ways for a woman to interact even with a male subordinate that signals to him and others her endorsement of his mature manhood in relation to her as a woman. I do not have in mind anything like sexual suggestiveness or innuendo. Rather, I have in mind culturally appropriate expressions of respect for his kind of strength and glad acceptance of his gentlemanly courtesies. Her demeanor, the tone and style and disposition and discourse of her ranking position can signal clearly her affirmation of the unique role that men should play in relationship to women owing to their sense of responsibility to protect and lead. So again, he's saying, even if you are a woman in position of authority, you should speak to your male subordinates in such a way that you're still affirming their masculinity, that you're still affirming and that you accept that God basically has given them a leadership role, even though they are subordinate to you. He said that as a woman, you can do this and you should do this. He goes on to say, it is obvious at this point that we are on the brink of contradiction. Suggesting that a woman may hold a position of leadership and fulfill it in a way that signals to men her endorsement of their sense of responsibility to lead. But the complexity of life requires us this risk. To illustrate, now I have to tell you, when I read this, I'll be honest with you, I said, you've got to be kidding me. He said to illustrate. Now he's going to give an illustration of how a woman can be in a position of authority, but still speak to and affirm the masculinity and the leadership responsibilities of a man. He goes on to say, here to illustrate, it is simply impossible that from time to time, a woman not be put in a position of influencing or guiding men. For example, here it is, a housewife in her backyard may be asked by a man how to get to the freeway, not her husband, another man, how to get to the freeway. At that point, she is giving a kind of leadership. Now, when I heard this, I went, who thinks that this is leadership? She has superior knowledge that the man needs, and he submits himself to her guidance. But we all know that there is a way for the housewife to direct the man in which neither of them feels their mature femininity or masculinity compromise. So he's saying here, let's say my wife was in the backyard and someone asked her, let's say somebody, our next door neighbor said, hey, Karen, do you know how to get to so-and-so? I need to get there. I'm not sure. Do you know how to get to so-and-so? So-and-so's place. Do you know how to get to Gateway Seminary Library? I know your husband goes there. Do you know how to get there? Because I want to use their library also. He says, Karen should speak to that man in such a way that doesn't compromise her mature femininity or his mature masculinity. She should speak to him in such a way that affirms his leadership and his masculinity, just by giving him directions of how to get somewhere. Okay. He goes on to say, quote, it is not a contradiction to speak of certain kinds of influence coming from women to men in a way that affirms the responsibility of men to provide a pattern of strength and initiative. But as I said earlier, there are roles that strain the personhood of man and women too far to be appropriate, productive, and healthy for the overall structure of home and society. Some roles will involve kinds of leadership and expectations of authority and forms of strength as to make it unfitting for a woman to feel the role. He's saying that there are some leadership roles that women cannot be in because it would compromise their their mature femininity and a man's masculinity. Okay, so he's saying that there are some roles that women should not feel. Makes it unfitting for a woman to feel. However, this is what he says. However, instead of trying to list what jobs might be fitting expressions for mature femininity or mature masculinity, it will probably be wiser to provide several guidelines. So he doesn't get into what the roles are or the jobs are. which is probably wise. It is obvious that we cannot and should not prohibit women from influencing men. For example, prayer is certainly a God-given authority. It means, I'm going to skip over that. He's just talking about praying for people. So the question should be put, what kind of influence would be inappropriate for mature women to exercise towards men? It would be hopeless to try to define this on a case-by-case basis. There are thousands of different jobs in the church and in the world with an innumerable variety of relationships between men and women. More appropriate than a black and white list of man's work and woman's work is a set of criteria to help a woman think through whether the responsibilities of any given job allow her to uphold God's created order of mature masculinity and femininity. Now, let me say this. I'm going to stop right here for a second. Here's my thing. If there are certain roles that women cannot fulfill because it would compromise, let's say I'm a complementarian, right? And if I believe there are certain roles that would cause a woman to compromise her mature femininity and would violate a man's mature masculinity and would cause her to violate God's created order and design, should we not be listing out what those jobs are? Just to simply say, well, here are some guidelines. Like, no, we need to be clear about what that is, because what if you are a woman and you think you've done the right thing and you're not sure, but you're in this job, you might be compromising your femininity, the essence of your womanhood, and you might be violating a man's masculinity. You might be violating God's design and God's order, which according to the authors of this book, especially the two primary editors, is detrimental. There are others like John MacArthur who believes a woman who goes into a position of authority in our society, it leads to the detriment of society. So should we not therefore define clearly what the jobs are? If that's the case, I think we would want to do that to make sure that, because in the Bible, there are sins of commission and there are sins of omission. And if we are saying that women fulfilling certain roles would cause them to compromise their mature femininity and it would violate a man's mature masculinity, we would need to be clear, not just have guidelines. We would need to be clear about what those roles are if that's the case. That's my point of view. Okay, let me go on. He goes on to say, let's see. Okay, maybe he said, more appropriate than a black and white list of man's work and women's work is a set of criteria to help a woman think through whether the responsibility of any given job allows her to uphold God's created order of mature masculinity and femininity. Now, again, he's saying here, women, your primary function in life, your primary goal, the essence of your womanhood is to uphold the masculinity of a man. Here's one possible set of criteria. All acts of influence and guidance can be described along these two continuums. Is it personal or non-personal? Is it directive or is it non-directive? This is the guidelines that John Piper says you should guide you when it comes to the type of work that you do. Is the work, when you engage with a man, is it more personal or is it non-personal? Is it directive or is it non-directive? To the degree that a woman's influence over a man is personal and directive, it will generally offend a man's good, God-given sense of responsibility and leadership, and thus controvert God's created order. So if you have a job where your influence over man is personal and directive, he is saying it will offend a man's good, God-given sense of responsibility and leadership, and you will be controverting God's created order. You'd be in direct violation. You will be in direct disobedience to God's created order. So he goes on, quote, a woman may design the traffic pattern of a city street and thus exert a kind of influence over all male drivers. But this influence will be non-personal and therefore not necessarily an offense against God's order. So if you are a woman and you are designing the traffic patterns of a city street, that's cool because you're not really personally involved with giving direction to men. It's more general, it's more non-personal, and it's not directive, so you're okay. Similarly, the drawing and specifications of a woman architect may guard the behaviors of contractors and laborers, but it may be so non-personal that the feminine masculine dynamic of the relationship is negligible. It's negligible. it really doesn't matter that much. I'm having a hard time pronouncing that word for a second. Negligible. So anyway, you know what the word is. Okay, so he's saying that if you are a female architect and you draw up plans, and then there are contractors who are male who have to carry out those plans, really it's non-personal. So the dynamic is really, it's not even, it's negligible. I'm quick trying to say that word. It's just, it really barely registers at all. It's not a problem, is what he's saying. On the other hand, the relationship between husband and wife is very personal. All acts of influence lie on the continuum between personal and non-personal. The closer they get to the personal side, the more inappropriate it becomes for women to exert directive influence. But the second continuum may qualify the first. Some influence is very directive, some is non-directive. For example, a drill sergeant would epitomize directive influence. It would be hard to see how a woman could be a drill sergeant over men without violating their sense of masculinity and her sense of femininity. What do you do if you have a woman who's a general in the military? She's going to be directive. According to John Piper, and it's going to be personal, according to John Piper, this would be a wrong role for her to fulfill in society. Non-directive influence proceeds with petition and persuasion instead of directives. And then he gives some example about Abigail talking to David. Let's see. I didn't want to read all. Okay, let me read this. Okay. If a woman jobs, when you combine these two continuums, personal, non-personal, directive, non-directive, what emerges is this. If a woman's job involves a good deal of directives towards men, the men in general, if a woman's job involves a good deal of directives towards men, they will in general need it to be non-personal. So if you as a woman, if you're giving general directives to men, you have to do that a lot, then you have to make it non-personal in some way, form, or fashion. He goes on to say, the God-given sense of responsibility for leadership in a mature man will not generally allow him to flourish long under personal directive leadership of a female superior. A man cannot flourish as a man if he is under the leadership of a woman and is being given directives in a personal way. J.I. Packer, who's another scholar, suggests that, quote, a situation in which a female boss has a male secretary puts strain on the humanity of both. I think that, end quote. And then John Piper says, I think this would be true in other situations as well. Some of the more obvious ones would be in military combat settings, if women were positioned so as to deploy and command men, or in professional baseball, if a woman is made the umpire to call balls and strikes and frequently to settle heated disputes among men. Yes, he's including sports in this. Now, I know some of you probably, men and women, you're looking at this going, are you kidding me? Is he really detailing this like this? Yes. And I would stress that this is not necessary owing to male egotism, but to a natural and good penchant given by God. Let's see. Conversely, if a woman's relation to a man is very personal, then the way she offers guidance will need to be non-directive. All right. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. So you hear John Piper's view where this is concerned, that there's this continuum, personal, non-personal, directive, non-directive. And women, when you engage with other men who are subordinate to you, you got to keep in mind, okay, well, is this personal? Do I need to do it non-personal? And is this directive? This should be non-directive. Even if somebody asks you for directions to the freeway, you've got to do it in such a way that you are being non-directive and non-personal, okay? So you don't offend the masculinity of a man. To which some women have said, and I agree, and other men have said, and I agree, if a man's masculinity is that fragile that a woman tells him what to do in a personal and directive way and he falls apart, or if a man's masculinity is that fragile that if he works for another woman, I've worked for women. I've worked for my mom, who was a woman. When I worked for a major toy company, my boss, my direct boss, was a woman. When I worked for a manufacturing company, the CEO of the company was a woman that I had a lot of personal and direct interaction with, because we would talk and everything. We're friends to this day. I flourish under every single one of them. The idea that John Piper and J.I. Packer, who are scholars that I respect, but the idea that, hey, if you're a man and you're serving under a woman as a secretary, you can't flourish. There is given in this no evidence of this. It is simply asserted. An assertion is not truth. Just because you assert something to be true does not make it true. I need facts. I need figures. I need studies to show that this is true. And they offer none of that. And yet, as I said before, this is one of the books that people go to. And people quote John Piper's view of what it means to be masculine or a man and what it means to be feminine or to be a woman. Let me calm down because I want to maintain respect. But my point here is that these are things that are asserted without evidence, without facts, without figures. It is subjective, simply saying, well, if you talk to a man in a personal and direct way, you are going to offend, you are going to suppress his masculinity. My point again, if you are a man and a woman says, listen, what you need to do is go down, turn left, go up 3 streets and then turn right, and then you will be at the freeway, and you are suppressed because of that, call me. I do a class on emotional intelligence. We need to talk. There's something wrong. And this has to do, that the problem is not with the woman given the direction. The problem is with the guy's psyche. The problem is with the guy's ego, okay? Contrary to what they said, well, it's not just a matter of ego. If a woman is a woman can't be an umpire at a baseball game because it would offend the sensibilities of a male, there is no established basis for this. This is based upon cultural ideas of our 21st century Western world. It is not based upon the biblical text. He does not, by the way, you notice by reading all of that, he doesn't quote one scripture. He doesn't quote any scriptures to back up what he's saying. Now, he is a scholar. He's Dr. John Piper. He's very respected in circles. I have respect for him and other things that he's written. Here, though, he gives no biblical text. He doesn't give any psychological or sociological facts to back up what he's saying. This is his view. This is his interpretation. He may believe it's based upon the biblical text, but I don't think it is. So the problem with all of these statements that I just read to you, okay, and I need to hurry, but I'm already gone for an hour. Man, I can't believe this. The problem with all of these statements is when you put these statements into a first century context, we're going to run into problems with applying the instructions and the viewpoints that these men have laid out. Now, there's more to it, okay? We're going to be talking more about the views of complementarians, but I'm saying what we've just read, if we take and put it back into a first century context, if we apply it to Paul's words about the familia, the family in Ephesians chapter 5 and Ephesians chapter 6, we're going to run into some problems. We're going to run into problems applying these instructions and these statements in a consistent manner. We are going to run into problems. If men and women are to lead, as these men say, in the home, the church, and society, or to say it another way, if women are not to lead, but rather they're to follow and affirm and receive and nurture the masculinity and leadership of men, then what do we do with first century Greco-Roman women, as I said earlier, who had male slaves under their authority and rule? First century Greco-Roman women, this would also apply to some Jewish women, they had male slaves who would be under their rule. John Piper's argument that mature biblical femininity means receiving and gladly accepting the strength and leadership of worthy men, even those who are not her husband in some form, it doesn't work in a first century context because first century Greco-Roman women were in authority over male slaves in their household. And this is the cultural context of Ephesians chapter 6, verse 5-9 that I just read to you earlier, where Paul says, slaves, this is how I want you to relate to your masters. And I said to you, Paul could also, and in all probability, was also talking to female slave owners. So if women are to receive from all men in some form their leadership and their strength, are we to say, how do women in the first century Greco-Roman world receive the leadership of her slave, who's a male? Are we to say that Christian slaves were not worthy men? Does it not count? If it does count, how does she subordinate herself to the leadership of her slave? It doesn't make any sense in terms of first century world and in terms of what they are saying here. that all women, if you understand the way slaves were thought of in the first century, now Christians, of course, would not have thought this way. They would have affirmed the value, but slaves were thought of as living tools. They were thought of as not being intelligent, though there were many intelligent slaves, but they were thought of as living tools, okay? They were property. And you're saying that a woman in the first century Greco-Roman world, a well-to-do woman who had her own household and who had male slaves under her, she is supposed to receive his strength and his leadership where she's concerned? How exactly does that work? This is why we say, and this is how we see that frames, especially cultural frames, are so important. Because when you take this teaching, put it back in the first century, it doesn't make sense and it doesn't work. It doesn't work. To say to a female slave owner, now, Paul, let me say this. Paul did say to slave masters, men and women, treat your slaves, I'm paraphrasing him, but it was the idea of don't threaten them, treat them with some respect, be kind, be benevolent to them. He did tell them that, but he never said to them, you need to receive their leadership. If you're a female slave owner and you have a male slave, make sure, Paul didn't, let me put it like this, Paul didn't separate out and says, oh, wait a minute, postscript. Women, those of you who have female slaves, make sure that you talk to them in such a way that you affirm their masculinity and you receive their leadership and their strength because, you know, God made them to be rulers over you. Do you see what I'm saying? When you put this back into a first century context, when you apply it to Ephesians chapter 6, to those to whom the text was originally written, and you take these words and you put them back, doesn't fit, just doesn't fit. Okay, so this is why the frames we're operating from, John Piper is operating from a 21st century frame, taking first century words, putting them in a 21st century context, and saying, this is how we then interpret the first century words. No, we have to look at what did those words mean to the original audience. Then we can derive, once we know the meaning, then we can derive application for us today. So the overall complementarian argument and position that men are to be the primary leaders in the home, in the church, and in society cannot be consistently applied to a first century context when we factor in the cultural circumstances of that time period. When you say, hey, okay, wait a minute, if you're saying that, how would that fit with the first century woman who was a leader, who had her own business, who had men working underneath her, who had slaves working for her? How is she to receive the leadership of her slave? Okay, does that make sense? All right, everybody's so quiet. All right, now this leads to a third, I'm just gonna go on and hopefully we can finish this. This leads to a third contextual frame that we need to bring with us, that we need to apply. So the first frame is we have to understand the Bible, while for us, was not originally written to us. Second frame is that we have to ask ourselves the question when we're reading the biblical text, any biblical text, especially those that have to do with women and their relationship to men, we have to ask ourselves the question, what did it mean to the people in their day? Not our day, in their day. Third frame is we've got to bring consistency in our interpretation. We have to use a frame of consistency when it comes to our interpretation of the text. Hopefully this is what I'm trying to end here. We got to be consistent. We have to have a frame of consistency that when we apply certain things, we need to apply them consistently and see, wait a minute, does that actually work? Like we just applied the concept of John Piper's view of women and men, and we say, well, if we apply that to the first century to be consistent, that wouldn't work. Yeah, we could apply it today in the maybe the 21st century. I still don't think it will work very well. But if you go back to the first century, how is that going to work? Okay. So there needs to be a frame of consistency in our interpretation of the text. One of the arguments for the rule of men over women, or the subordination of women to men, is based on a certain reading and interpretation of 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 12 and 13, and Genesis chapter 2, verse 18 and 24. Now, 1 Timothy 2, 12 and 13 is the verse that says that women are not to teach or have authority over men. Verse 13 says, for Adam was created first and then Eve. So the interpretation of that is because men were created first, they are the ones who are in the lead. Because women were created second, they are the ones who are to be led. Because men were created first, they are to rule. Because women were created second, they are to be ruled. Okay, this is based upon how they read 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 12 and 13, and Genesis chapter 2, verse 18 through 24, which we're going to look at in just a moment. So it is taught that men being created first in Genesis 2 is proof that God ordained and designed man to lead and women to submit to his leadership and to follow his lead. Because in Genesis chapter 1, it just says God created man and woman. Genesis chapter 2, we see a detail of how that creation took place. God created Adam first, then he created Eve. And so complementarians teach, many scholars and pastors teach, that this order of creation establishes man as the one who God designated to lead. They call this the creational order. This is God's design. Man came first, therefore he's the lead. Woman came second, she is to follow his lead. All right? Complementarian scholars who follow this line of reasoning, they appeal to an ancient Near Eastern custom called the law of the firstborn, or the law of primogeniture. This means the one who was born first. They use that to assert that this is why this is true. It was an ancient Near Eastern custom that the law of primogeniture, or the law of the firstborn, basically states that the firstborn male child is the leader of the family after the father dies. Because he is the firstborn and will be responsible for the leadership and provision of the family, that firstborn son is usually given a bigger inheritance than the other members of the family. He's given more than anyone else. Often he's given a double portion. Wayne Grudem appeals to this ancient Near Eastern custom in a book he wrote called Evangelical Feminism and Biblical Truth. So let me read to you again from Grudem. This is his other book that he wrote. Now, this book was written a few years ago. It was written in, I'm trying to see, this book was written in 2004 and reprinted again in 2012, okay? So he appeals to this ancient Near Eastern custom. And again, this book is called Evangelical Feminism and Biblical Truth, an analysis of more than 100 disputed questions. So this is the book here, okay? This is what he says on page 67 of his book in regards to the law of the firstborn. Okay, he says, let me find it here. Oh, page 67, okay. He says, Paul's reason for why women are not to lead is the order of creation. For Adam was formed first. Now he's quoting 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 13. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. Paul does not use some local situation in Ephesus for a reason, such as saying the women aren't well educated there in Ephesus, or for you have some disruptive women teaching false doctrine there in Ephesus. So he's saying that many of the cultural reasons that scholars, especially egalitarian scholars, give for why Paul is saying this, he says, this is not what Paul says. He says, no, Paul, points back to the original time of creation, before there was any sin in the world, and sees that there was a purpose of God indicated in the order of creation. For Adam was formed first and then Eve. Now, this is what Paul wrote. Now, let me say this. All Paul said was, for Adam was formed first, then Eve. That's all Paul said. Paul assumes that his readers will understand that when God created Adam first and then gave commands to him alone, and then later created Eve, that God was giving a leadership role to Adam. People in the ancient world where the firstborn son had a leadership role in the family would have understood this. But we do not need to assume that Paul was endorsing the entire system of primogeniture, at least not in all of its details. Now, I have to say this is a slick move, because I'm going to share with you some of the details. But by saying this, he's saying, well, Paul didn't have to go by all of the details. But wait a minute, remember, what is the contextual frame that I'm talking about here? Consistency. Consistency of frames, or consistency of interpretation. What you're going to hear is, what I'm going to show you in a few seconds, he's not being consistent in his interpretation using this cultural context. He's appealing to a cultural context. I said that cultural context is one of the frames that we need to think about. How would people have thought about it in the time when it was written? So he's appealing to that. However, he's not being consistent. So when we apply these rules of interpretation, these frames, these contextual frame, we got to be consistent. So let me share with you. Let me go on. We do not need to assume that Paul was endorsing the entire system of primogeniture. I'm thinking, why? Why would we not assume that? It is enough simply to say that people who were familiar with that system would have had no trouble understanding Paul's reasoning. The firstborn male in any family is assumed to be the leader. in that family in his generation. This is true. This is true. And Adam was the firstborn in his generation, so he was the leader. So he's making a true statement in the cultural world, the ancient Near East, and I think in the Mediterranean world, the firstborn son, in the Mediterranean world, the firstborn son is assumed to be the leader of the family. The firstborn son is assumed to be the leader of the family. The firstborn what? Son. Assumed to be what? The leader of the family. So therefore, because Adam, Grudem is saying, was created first, he is the leader. Okay, let me read to you something else he said before I critique this. Let's see. He says, this is page 68. I just read to you page 67, this is page 68. By virtue of the order of creation, Paul sees that God gave to Adam a leadership role that Eve did not have. And he also sees, under the guidance of the Holy Spirit in writing scripture, that this pattern is fundamental to manhood and womanhood in such a way that God wants it reflected in the leadership positions that he entrusts to people in the church. So Grudem is saying, not only does this apply to men and women in general, not only does this apply to men and women at home, it applies to women. The Adam being created first applies to men and women in the church, okay? When men have governing and teaching authority over the church, they reflect something of the character of manhood in the way God intended it to function, and this is right and appropriate and pleasing to God. When women support men in these leadership positions, they reflect something of the excellence of their creation as women in the image of God, and this is right and appropriate and pleasing in God's sight. In this way, the beauty of both manhood and womanhood is reflected in the conduct of the church. Okay, so I'll read this too, because this does come up. He says, some egalitarians object. If being created first means that one is the leader, then the animals should have authority over human beings. But that objection fails to understand that authority relationships among humans apply only to human beings. And notice what he says here. The authority of relationship among human beings apply only to human beings. So he's narrowing the scope of the authority by saying, well, this only applies to human beings. It would be foolish to think otherwise, because God gave to human beings the responsibility to rule over the creation and to subdue the earth for his glory. That egalitarian objection is similar to saying, if the older son is in charge of pruning trees because he was there first, then squirrels and rabbits should have authority over him because they were in the backyard before he arrived. Such a suggestion is foolish, of course, because we realize the authority relationships among humans apply only to humans. Okay. He goes on to say, if we say that, and another objection egalitarians make is to say, if we say that Adam had authority because he was created first, then we should say that the Old Testament concept of primogeniture, which gives a greater inheritance and larger authority to the eldest son, should be followed by societies today as well. But Paul does not mention any Old Testament system of inheritance rights or any developed system of primogeniture. Now, here's the problem I have. He wants to utilize the principle of primogeniture, but also wants to say, but the details don't apply. That's not being consistent. There's nothing in the text that says Paul didn't apply the details, or we shouldn't assume that the details shouldn't apply. No, unless Paul says otherwise, we should assume the details apply. Just because Paul doesn't say the details don't apply, just because Paul doesn't detail it out, if Paul is utilizing, and I'm using the word if on purpose, if he's utilizing the law of the firstborn, the law of primogeniture, we should assume that that with it goes everything that applies to the law, unless Paul says otherwise. On what basis do you say, well, the details don't apply? That's not being consistent. That's not being consistent. Okay, let me go on. Paul does not mention any Old Testament system of inheritance rights. You wouldn't have to. If you knew the law of primogeniture, you would already understand that the inheritance rights were inherent in the laws of primogeniture, the law of the firstborn. You would not need to mention it because it was already there. It would be understood. Because, by the way, Paul simply says Adam was formed first. Paul doesn't say, and according to the law of primogeniture, what Grudem says is people would have understood this naturally. Well, I am saying if Paul was using the law of primogeniture, I'm going to tell you right now, I don't believe he was. If Paul was using the law of primogeniture, then people would have naturally assumed all of the details that go with the law of primogeniture. If one is good, to be consistent, the other is good. If people would have assumed Paul was using the law of primogeniture, people would have assumed all of the details that go with the law of primogeniture. You cannot excise that out because it doesn't fit your ideology. It doesn't fit your theology. You can't do that, okay? Because that's not being consistent. All right. He says, Paul's reasoning is much simpler than that. Adam was created first, was put in the garden, given command by God. Eve was created as a helper for Adam. In that sequence of events, God gave to Adam a leadership role. This should be evident to anyone, whether he has heard of the Old Testament of primogeniture or not, though that Old Testament concept is consistent with this idea, and it may be an analogy that will help readers understand it more readily. So here's my thing. How would people, if they've never heard of the law of primogeniture, how would they understand then that Adam is created, that being first means you're the leader? Again, consistency. The consistency of the argument doesn't stand when you apply it back to itself. Cheryl Lucas, Jeremy say that, apply back to self. When you apply it back to self, to itself, it becomes inconsistent, okay? He goes on to say on page 69, when Paul bases his argument on the order of creation of Adam and Eve, it indicates that his command about women not teaching or having authority in the assembled congregation transcends cultures and societies. Now, he's saying this is based upon the law of primogeniture, which is a cultural concept. But his argument is that this was a creation order. It was a creation design. All right, let me read you one more thing, and then we're going to, I'm going to critique this, and we're going to end. Let me read to you from page 122. I know this is taking a while. I hope that this is, if you've heard these arguments, I hope you're going, Mike, thank you. This is helping me to really think through some things here. This is why I'm saying the frames are so important. This is page 122. This is the last thing I'm going to read. He says, in fact, when the idea of primogeniture, oh, wait, let me see if I need to back up. Okay, let me back up. The Bible clearly gives human beings authority to rule over the animal kingdom. Fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. So we see from Genesis itself that authority belongs to things created first. Excuse me. So we see from Genesis itself that authority belonging to things created first is not an absolute rule that applies to everything ever created. It is a limited principle that applied to the creation of Adam and Eve, and that is clear because the Bible views it this way. Now, let me say, this is clear because that's how Wayne Grudem interprets the text. It's not what the Bible says, it's how he interprets what it says. In fact, when the idea of primogeniture, the idea that leadership in a family belongs to the firstborn son, is applied in later Old Testament narratives, it is not an absolute principle either. It only applies, now notice what he says, it only applies to the oldest son, not to the firstborn daughter. This is true. It only applies within each family, not to children born earlier in neighboring families. This is true. And it surely does not apply to animals born in the household before the children. True. The concept is a limited principle that applies within human families, and there is no inconsistency in limiting its application in that way in the story of Adam and Eve. That part is not true. And this is what I'm going to show you why the law of primogeniture. I've heard so many complementarians use this to say Adam was created first. This brings into effect, or this refers to the law of primogeniture, the law of the firstborn, because the law of the firstborn states that the firstborn male in the family becomes the leader of the family upon the death of the father. He is prepared to be the leader of the family. So therefore, because Adam was created first, he is the leader, Eve is the one who follows. And Grudem says there is no inconsistency in applying this to Adam and Eve. Yes, there is. I'm going to tell you why. There's a problem. This is the problem with his argument. While the law of primogeniture, the law of the firstborn, it is an ancient Near Eastern custom. Number one, it is not presented as a creation ordinance established by God. As a matter of fact, when you look at the law of primogeniture, the law of the firstborn in Scripture, you see God ignoring and or violating the law of the firstborn as the head of the family or the leader of the family several times throughout the Scripture. God just completely ignores it. He violates it. Let me give you some examples. Isaac and Ishmael, the two sons of Abraham. Who was born first? Ishmael. He was the firstborn. But God says the promise is not coming through Ishmael. He's not the one. It is Isaac, who was technically speaking, in terms of birth order, Isaac is the second son. In terms of Sarah's son, he is her first son. But in terms of, we're looking at this from an ancient Near Eastern perspective, we would go, Ishmael was born first, not Isaac. Ishmael is the firstborn. Abraham even says to God, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. Let him be the one. God says he's not the one. It's Isaac. God ignores the law of the firstborn in its ancient Near Eastern context. Why? It is not a creation ordinance. It is not something that God established at creation. Here's another example, Jacob and Esau. You go back, you read the biblical text about in the book of Genesis. This is all in the book of Genesis, Jacob and Esau. What did God say about Jacob and Esau? The prophecy that came forth, the younger shall serve the elder. That is a total violation of the law of primogeniture. And it was God who prophesied the younger shall serve the elder. Esau was born first, Jacob was born second. Here's another example, Joseph and his brothers. Remember Joseph and his brothers? The brothers got mad at Joseph because Joseph was having all of these dreams. What was Joseph's dreams about? That he was going to be a leader. Okay, was Joseph the firstborn? No, he was not. He was not the firstborn. In terms of, talk about ancient Near Eastern custom, if you look at it from the outside, Joseph is not the firstborn. Matter of fact, if I remember correctly, he was the last born before his brother Benjamin was born. Okay, so he was at one point the baby of the family. But what was his dreams about? He was going to be a leader. What was his dreams about? That his brothers and his mother and fathers would bow down to him. How is this so if it is a creational ordinance from God that the ancient Near Eastern idea is that, well, I'm saying two things at once. My point is this was not something that God created. This was an ancient Near Eastern custom. Nowhere does it say that God says, hey, here's one of my commandments. The firstborn, that shall be the person in charge. God never says that. It's simply an ancient Near Eastern culture that people followed. But we see God over and over in scripture. I've given you what, 1, 2, 3 examples so far where God totally ignores it and or violates it. Here's a fourth one, David and his brothers. King David, the one who became the shepherd boy, youngest of his brothers. When when Samuel comes and he anoints, because God said there's a king among these brothers, he looks at the one who's the tallest, handsome, broad shouldered, like, God, this surely must be the one. God says, nope, you're not him. Then he goes to the next one. David is not the oldest. David is the youngest, considered the runt of the family. God makes him king. God ignores and God violates the law of primogeniture. So the idea that this is like an ironclad law, now, he doesn't say, to be fair, Grudem doesn't say this is an ironclad law. But he implies this is a law consistently that is applied, and God applies it to Adam. We don't see God applying this law at all through the scriptures. What we see God consistently do is ignore it in the pages of the Old Testament. Also, here's the other problem with Grudem's argument. Grudem himself said, let me go back to page 122. And again, we're talking about the frames, and the frame here is one of consistency. And we see that while it is a cultural context to say, hey, there is a law of primogeniture, which we do see it in the law of Moses. The law of Moses, I believe, talks about it. I think it talks about it. And we see that people do give things to their firstborn within the biblical text. When we see God, he ignores it. Matter of fact, another example is, and I don't remember who was first and who was second, but when Jacob is old and he meets again his son Joseph, and Joseph brings his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, before him. It says that one is older than the other. I'm sorry I didn't look up the reference. I forget which one is which. Well, it may be Ephraim is older than Manasseh. If I'm wrong, I'll correct it next week. It may be that Manasseh is older than Ephraim. It says that when Joseph brings his sons to his father Jacob and he wants him to bless him, Jacob crosses his hand and he gives the blessing to the younger one, not to the older one. Once again, we see the law of primogeniture being totally ignored and or violated. And he's prophesying, so he's speaking from God, okay? God just ignores and violates this over and over and over. So we do not see consistently, if we could see God consistently just applying it and it being applied, then we would go, oh, all right, well, yeah, maybe Adam was first and that means he's the leader. We don't see that in the biblical text. Now, this is the thing that Grudem says on page 122. The law of primogeniture applies to the oldest son, not to the firstborn daughter. And I said this is true. It only applies within each family, not to children born earlier in neighboring families. And it surely does not apply to animals born in the household before the children. The concept is a limited principle that applies within human families. And he says there's no inconsistency in applying its application in that way in the story to Adam and Eve. Here is the limitation. He says this is applied in families. He says this is applied to the oldest son, not to the oldest daughter. True. And it is applied only to human families, not between human families and animals. True. But here's the problem. Here's the inconsistency. The law of primogeniture was applied between siblings in a family, never between husbands and wives. Never. Nowhere in the biblical text. And I don't know, I could be wrong about this because I haven't done the research, but I would dare say nowhere in ancient Near Eastern text do we see the law of primogeniture being applied to husbands and wives. Eve is presented not as Adam's sister. Eve is presented as Adam's wife, not his sister, his wife. Nowhere in Genesis is Eve called Adam's sister. She is presented as his wife. Nowhere in the biblical text, again, do we see the law of primogeniture used to establish the husband's authority over the wife. Let me say that again. Nowhere in the biblical text do we see the law of primogeniture used to establish the husband's authority over the wife. So while Grudem's and others have applied a cultural context and a cultural custom, it is not being applied consistently, and it is not being applied correctly in alignment with how that cultural custom actually worked and how it was actually applied. The law of primogeniture was between siblings in a family, and the oldest sibling was the one that was made the head. It did not apply between husbands and wives. Now, let me say one more thing, and I'm going to close. So by the way, did everybody get that? Does everyone get what I'm saying? The law, this is why he said there is no consistency applying it to Adam and Eve. There's no inconsistency. Yes, there is. The law of primogeniture, I defy any complementarian to take me to the biblical text and say, hey, this is where it's applied between husbands and wives. Nowhere is it applied between husbands and wives. And by the way, here's the other thing. The law of primogeniture was not even mentioned in the book of Genesis. Scholars assume it's there because they read Genesis chapter 1 in the light of 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 13. They say, well, God says that Adam was formed first. Oh, so when we go back to Genesis chapter 2, we see Adam being formed. That must be referred to the law of primogeniture. God never says that. And here's the thing. This is what I'm going to close with. When we look in Genesis chapter 1 in the biblical text, we see a pattern being established. When something or someone is made a leader or they're given authority to rule, the biblical text tells us plainly so that who is to rule over what. The Bible tells us plainly who is to rule over what. So in Genesis chapter 1, verses 16 through 18, the sun is to rule over the day and the moon is to rule over the night. How do we know? The scripture tells us plainly that he gave the sun to rule by day and the moon to rule by night. It tells us what is ruling over what plainly. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 through 28, man and women, humanity, are to rule over the earth and all that the earth contains. Psalms chapter 8, verse 5 through 8 also tells us this. How do we know that humanity, man and women, male and female together, are to rule? Because the Bible plainly tells us. God says to the man and woman, I've created you in my image and likeness. Therefore, you're to have authority and dominion. You together are to have authority and dominion over the earth and over all of the animals. We are plainly told who is going to rule over what. Jacob is to rule over Esau. How do we know this? We are plainly told the younger shall serve, the older shall serve the younger. The elder shall serve, or the older shall serve the younger. We're plainly told this. Joseph is to rule over his brothers. How do we know? Joseph is given prophetic dreams by God that he is going to be a ruler. Again, the Bible plainly tells us who is ruling over who. David is to rule over his brothers and over Israel as king. How do we know this? We are plainly told that David was picked by God to be the king of Israel. Over and over and over, when someone, by the way, how do we know that the judges, you know the book of Judges, who and people were raised up to judge Israel, meaning to be their savior, to act on Israel's behalf? to lead them out of bondage, to defend them against their enemies. These were leaders. How do we know that they were to lead? The Bible tells us God raised up so-and-so to be a judge. Over and over, we're told, we're not left clueless, and it's not ambiguous about who is going to lead. So when we get to the creation of Adam, in Genesis chapter 2, the second creation story that details us how the creation of Adam and Eve happened, what do we read? Turn to Genesis chapter 2 real quick. This is where we're going to close. Genesis chapter 2, we're going to look at verse 18. Genesis 2, verse 18. It says in verse 18, and the Lord God said, it is not good that man should be alone. By the way, we're going to be going in more depth about this later. I will make him a helper comparable to him. Out of the ground, the Lord God formed every beast of the field and every bird of the air and brought them to Adam to see what he would call them. And whatever Adam called each living creature, that was its name. So Adam gave names to all the cattle, to the birds of the air, and to the beasts of the field. But for Adam, there was not found a helper comparable to him. And the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall on Adam, and he slept. And he took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh in its place. Then the rib which the Lord God had taken from man, he made into a woman, and he brought her to the man. And Adam said, this is now bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Notice what happened. Notice what is said here. What does Adam say when the woman is brought to him? He says, this is now, let me put it like this. Does Adam say, cool, somebody for me to rule over? No, he doesn't say that. He doesn't say, cool, somebody, now I get to really exercise my leadership capabilities because God created somebody for me to rule over. Let me say this too. When God said, it is not good for man to be alone, I will make him a helper comparable to him. God did not say, it's not good for man to be alone, so I'm going to make somebody for him to rule over. That's not what the text says. We're going to get into what does it mean, a helper comparable to him, an ezer kenegdo. We're going to talk about what that Hebrew phrase, those Hebrew words mean. What does Adam say? She's taken out of me, she's bone of my bone, she's flesh of my flesh. So there is no mention of who rules over who. Now, going back to the pattern from Genesis chapter 1, we begin to see whenever God establishes who reigns over what, we are told clearly. When God creates Eve, there is no mention of Adam ruling over Eve. Now, if we assume that the creation of man and woman took place on the sixth day of creation, as it says in Genesis chapter 1, then in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 and 28, let me go back there. So we are assuming, based upon the biblical text, that the creation of Adam happened that we see in Genesis chapter 2 happened on the sixth day of creation, as told us in Genesis chapter 1. And in Genesis chapter 1, when the creation of man and woman happened on the sixth day, Adam was created first, then Eve was created first. What do we see? So let me break it down like this. So God creates Adam, says he needs someone to be a helper, an ezer to him. So God puts Adam to sleep. God creates the woman, brings her to the man. The man says, wow, this is now bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. Then God speaks to them and says in verse 26, chapter 1, so God created man in his own image. Then verse 28, then God blessed him and said, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the fowls of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. God created man and woman in his own image, and he said to them, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, have dominion. He said that to the man and the woman. What were they have to have dominion over? The fish of the sea, the fowls of the air, the creatures of the field. God never says, hey, I've created both of you. You are both to have authority and dominion over the earth. Oh, and by the way, in case you're wondering, Adam, you're in charge. He never says that. But this is how complementarian scholars and complementarian pastors read the text. They read it as God saying, well, God gave Adam rule. On what basis? The law of primogeniture. This is Adam's wife, not Adam's sister. Well, God said, I give you authority, yes, to man and woman. And God never says, there are times I'm the oldest in my family. I'm the oldest boy, okay? And let me put it like this. Out of all my siblings, I'm the oldest. I got 9 siblings. I am the oldest. 2 of my brothers I grew up with. I grew up with my brother, my cousin, who was like a brother. We grew up in the same household together. There are times when my grandmother, my aunt, my mom, they would leave and they would go, Michael, you're in charge. They plainly stated who was in charge. Me, because I was the oldest. When God gives Adam and Eve their mandate in Genesis chapter 1, he commissions them. He says to both of them, you are my image, you are my likeness, which implies equal authority. He does not say, by the way, let me say this real quick. The law of primogeniture, when you have the firstborn, the law of primogeniture states that the firstborn gets more than the other siblings because he has to take care of the other siblings. We don't see God giving Adam more authority. We don't see God giving Adam more of the earth. He doesn't do that. He says, you both are to rule over the earth, over the fish, over the birds, over the cattle. He doesn't say, and Adam, I'm giving you a little bit more. You're both equal, but Adam, you're a little bit more equaler. And so Adam, you get to be in charge. That is not in the text. And to say that it is not exegesis, where we read out of the text what's there. It is eisegesis. It's reading something into the text. You have to read the law of primogeniture into the text. So I say, well, when the people have saw it this way, again, if Adam was presented as Eve's brother, then we might have a case for the law of primogeniture. He is never presented. And nowhere in the biblical text is Adam ever called Eve's brother. He is called Eve's husband. She is called his wife. And the law of primogeniture does not apply to husbands and wives. So that would not have been there. That would not have been the natural reading of the text. And also, when we see God giving them authority and dominion, they are given it equally. The law of primogeniture states that the firstborn gets more. Adam and Eve are given equal amounts of authority. They are to rule together. So what is plainly stated is that both man and woman are given equal authority. And we're going to talk more about what it means to be the image and likeness of God. I'll end on this. It's only after the fall in Genesis chapter 3, only after when they sin, that the authority structure changes. But the argument of complementarians that the leadership structure with man being in charge was established in Genesis 1 and 2, I have to say it is completely false. It is completely false. If we look at the law of primogeniture, if we take that cultural contextual frame and apply it consistently as to what it meant to the people in that day, it only applied to siblings, not to husbands and wives. You cannot use the law of primogeniture. Grudem is incorrect when he says that it is not inconsistent to apply the law of primogeniture or the law of the firstborn to Adam and Eve. They were not brothers and sisters, they were husbands and wives. Okay. I'm going to end there. Again, I went longer than I wanted to, but I wanted to make sure I get this out. Okay, I'm going to do my best, people, to keep this short, to keep it under an hour, or keep it an hour, no more than that. I'm going to really work on that real hard for next week, but I hope you got something out of this. You may need to go back and listen to this a little bit more, but if you found this was helpful, please share it with other people. Share it with other people. I encourage you to get or read Wayne Grudem's book. This one here, Evangelical Feminism and Biblical Truth, as well as the one that he co-edited with John Piper, Rediscovering Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, as well as Discovering Biblical Equality, which is the egalitarian view. I am going to be dealing more with these views, excuse me, and looking at what does the biblical text actually say. But the context that one of the contextual frames we need to operate by, that we looked at here today, is we must be consistent in the application of even cultural facts, cultural background. We've got to be consistent. We got to make sure that what we're saying is in alignment with how the culture actually functioned, how the culture actually worked. And to apply the law of the firstborn to Adam and Eve simply does not fit in with how the culture understood the law of the firstborn. All right. All right. God bless you. Thank you so much. Again, this will be on KIC TV in about an hour or so. At least by this evening, it'll be up there. So if you want to direct people to KIC TV so that they can watch this, feel free to do so. And please join us next week. God bless you. Thank you for staying with me for so long. And I pray that you continue to study God's word and continue to study with us as we explore who's the boss, women and men in biblical and cultural context. God bless you. We'll see you all next week.